Sonic, the heart of your system.
What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kit Guru, and in this one we're just going to take a bit of time to talk about the new AM4 chips, so the Ryzen 3000 CPUs, and also the X570 motherboards, and how the AM4 platform is maturing as a consequence or as a benefit of this AMD Ryzen 3000 launch. So let's get straight into the talking points. So I think it would be good to start by saying overall, I think Ryzen 3000 has been a really good success. AMD has delivered with the Zen 2 architecture. I think we found that in our review. And I mean, to be honest, I'm an enthusiast first, so I've read a lot of the reviews. I've seen a lot of the YouTubers' comments and watched a lot of the videos. I think overall it's been a very, very big success. I think our readers and the general enthusiast audience has agreed with that. The architecture looks good. The frequency is good enough. The gaming performance is massively improved versus previous generations, and the multi-threaded productivity performance is just superb. The value for money is fantastic. So I think AMD has really hit it out of the park, so to speak. So the success of AMD's Zen, Zen Plus, and obviously Zen 2 chips, Ryzen 1000, Ryzen 2000, Ryzen 3000, is pretty clear at the moment. I mean, obviously we don't have numbers on sales figures. I'm not sure if AMD even publishes those because that's important financial data. They did say at the LA event that they've shipped over 100 million cores. Now, what a core means, I don't really know. I'm not sure if that's been clarified since the LA event back in June, but they've shipped 100 million cores. So that's a big number. Let's not kid ourselves. It's a good number. If we jump onto Amazon, and we looked at this last week just before the launch, and we looked at this now, so about a week after the launch, AMD occupies 8 of the top 10 spots for the top selling processors. So just take that in for a moment. 2.5 years, they were basically, 2.5 years ago, I should say, they were basically nowhere. They had an architecture that was completely out of date, that was just lagging behind Intel, except at the really, really low end, really, really cheap segment of the market. And then Ryzen 1000 came along in March 2017 and completely changed the picture. And they've been building on that since then, now to the point where, like I say, on the Amazon page for processors, they got 8 out of the top 10 chips. That's crazy. And I should say this is Amazon UK, of course. And this is not, this is not a perfect metric of sales or of popularity of consumer and enthusiast consensus. But it's a pretty good metric considering their position just over 2.5 years ago. With that said, we're just going to explain some of our experiences with the teething issues, some of the challenges we've had with BIOSes, address some of the issues regarding AGESA data, voltages, because we've seen a lot of this information going around on the web and a lot of comments, boost clocks. So some of our internal testing that we wouldn't usually publish, we'd usually use for our internal data and for our internal knowledge. But we're going to share this in this one because I think it's a good forum to allow our readers, our viewers, to allow everybody to have the discussion so we can all share our knowledge on some of the challenges we're experiencing, how we've overcome those challenges, what we think the best thing to do is, whether it's wait a little bit longer before upgrading, whether it's look for new beta BIOSes. Let's talk about BIOSes, everybody's favorite topic. So the BIOS situation has actually been quite tough since launch, to be honest. The way it worked is AMD sent reviewers who had pre-release hardware a bunch of BIOSes for their motherboards that were tested by AMD, and these tended to have the AGESA 1.0.0.2 profile. I think it's Combo Pi or Combo AM4 is the word before. I forget. It's 1.0.0.2 in general. Now, of course, this had some issues. There were some other BIOSes that were released by the vendors with some newer AGESA code before the release. So I know some people tested with these, some people didn't. They weren't, I believe, verified by AMD, so you're kind of out on your own without any support from AMD, which is a challenging situation for these launches because bugs are rife. I mean, that's the way it goes with a new platform introduction. In the days since launch, there were suggestions of BIOS updates giving significantly improved performance and better gaming performance and better stability, better overclocking. And this might be the case. I mean, we're still early days, but it's not what I've seen personally from my testing behind the scenes. So we have tested a few different BIOSes on obviously our Gigabyte board and our ASRock board that we both tested with for the launch. And then I've also tested some other boards from the other two main vendors, from MSI and ASUS. So I've had a pretty decent overview with boards from all of the big 4 vendors. And the situation with BIOSes at the moment, it's quite challenging, to be honest. So if you are having BIOS issues, if you're looking at beta BIOSes, if you're having instability, I'd say hang in there because it's difficult at the moment. Everybody's obviously working really hard with the manufacturers and the software guys out in Taiwan, but it's difficult to get a stable BIOS through when things are coming through so thick and fast, especially for a lineup which stretches all the way back to processors from March 2017. and a platform that was introduced with a quad-core, low-end OEM-only chip, which is now supporting 12-core high-performance chips. Some of the BIOS issues I want to address through my test, and I'm going to look at my cheat sheet iPad here because I can't remember all of these issues. Like I say, it's quite tough when the platform launches, and there are issues which are quite widespread, quite unique sometimes, but there are different issues that we'll experience and we'll share here. So that if you've had similar issues, you can understand you're not on your own. Maybe just hang in there, or maybe share your solutions with us. That would be really good for our readers, for our viewers, so everybody can benefit from everybody's knowledge. So one of the interesting ones that we've seen is high voltage levels at stock. And I know this has been brought up on Reddit and other forums, and some of the AMD people, so Robert Hallock especially, has been really vocal and really helpful in trying to educate people on the dangers of high voltages, and also the lack of danger of high voltages. The situation that AMD is taking, that Robert's explaining, is that high voltages at low load conditions are not really a problem, unless they're consistently high when obviously you're loading the CPU. I guess the analogy you could use here is if someone sticks a heavy backpack on your back and you just stood still, it's not really a problem. You're not under high loads, so it's not really a problem. You're not going to get fatigued, you're not going to get injured. If someone then asks you to run up a hill with that heavy backpack, you're going to feel fatigued, you're going to feel injured, you're going to feel pretty stressed pretty quickly. If instead you take a bit of weight, a bit of voltage out of that backpack, then you're going to be able to do your task a bit easier, with less temperature, with less stress and less chance of injury. And that's kind of the same analogy. High voltages at low load at idle conditions are not really a problem. When you start stressing the CPU and putting current through the CPU, then you do have to reduce the voltage to compensate. And the motherboards are pretty good at doing this, but obviously when people are reading the idle voltages on the Windows desktop, they're seeing high numbers and they're getting a bit concerned. So I think the Reddit page that Robert Hallock explained this on is really, really good. It's telling you what to do if you do see consistently high voltages. So I'd advise you go over there, check that out, and make sure you do report high voltages if they're staying in place under load, and keep an eye on those temperatures. So some of the high voltage situations that we've seen with some of the BIOSes, and these are not just the launch BIOSes, these are some of the release BIOSes and some of the ones that we've been testing, is a significant difference in load power consumption and also idle power consumption based on some of the changed settings. So with one of the boards, when we switched from one board with a certain BIOS revision and a certain AGESA revision to another one with the same AGESA revision but a different BIOS revision, and obviously a different vendor, we saw a change in wall power draw in CPU only Cinebench loading of about 40 watts. So it jumped from about 210 to 220 watts up to about 260 watts. Now that's a big jump for wall power consumption, but if you take out the system overheads, so how much the efficiency of the power supply, how much our fans are consuming, how much our SSD, our RAM, our graphics card under idle, all these other components are consuming, and you look at the CPU only package power, which tended to be about 140 to 150 watts for the 3900X in our testing. If you add 40 watts to that, assuming the 40 watts is going to be mostly allocated to the CPU, that is quite a big difference. That's like, off the top of my head, that's like 30% difference. So that's quite a big difference just between different BIOSes and different motherboards. And that's something that I keep an eye on, because that has a real effect on cooling capacity, and might, I'm not going to say it will, because it's still quite low compared to the power consumption these chips and these power delivery solutions on the motherboards are rated for, but it might have a longevity effect. I mean, that still remains to be seen. So don't get caught up on that, but it might. It's worth keeping an eye on. So another of the BIOS issues that we've been seeing is the forcing of the motherboard and the system and the CPU to operate under peak current conditions all of the time. So AMD in Ryzen Master, you'll see this EDC value, which, if I quote AMD's reviewer's guide, is the maximum current in amps that can be delivered by a specific motherboard's voltage regulator configuration in a peak spike condition for a short period of time. This is 140 amps for 105 watt TDP processors. So that peak condition for a short period of time, that's important. So what that's saying is if you've got a short bursty load, or if you're just loading the CPU with a render or some video editing or something different, you can ramp up the current to 140 amps for a short period of time, and then the system assumes as soon as that load is removed, it will then drop the current to potentially avoid damage, potentially avoid overstressing the CPU, reduce your power consumption, all these other factors. If that's being glued and being held consistent for a short period of time or for continuous periods of time, that's not ideal if it's there for continuous periods of time, because it's just putting needless current into your CPU, putting needless power and energy usage into your system. it's not ideal. So that's a BIOS bug that we've seen. We have reported this to the vendor, and we did see that this was not a software read-in bug. This was having a tangible difference of about 20 watts when we were reading the wall power consumption. So we went from about 95 watt idle reading to about 120 watts wall power reading with this bug. So that's quite a big percentage jump on the CPU only power consumption in idle conditions. So that's one to keep an eye out for. Another of the issues that we've seen is applying a precision boost overdrive without user consent or warning. And this is one that I'm not particularly impressed by, if I'm being perfectly honest. Precision boost overdrive, is AMD's kind of one button overclocking version where you can eke that little bit of extra performance out of your Ryzen chip. But AMD is quite clear about this. It does not support the warranty, or does not deal with the warranty situation when precision boost overdrive is applied. So you are voiding your warranty. You're overclocking the chip. You're taking that decision to void your warranty. If you take that decision, that's fine. When a motherboard is applying that by default without your consent and potentially voiding your warranty, likely voiding your warranty, that's not good. That shouldn't be the case. The motherboards should be doing what they're told, not putting you in situations where you could accidentally and unknowingly void the warranty on your CPU. So that's not a good one. I'm unimpressed by that. I will be reporting it to the vendor and hoping that we get this fixed pretty quickly. The way to spot this is, well, you can look at power draw, you can look at load temperatures, but the voltage might be quite optimized in the conditions, so you can't really guarantee with those. But if you go into the Ryzen Master software in Windows, you can see whether it's operating, when you go into the home mode, you can see whether it's operating at default conditions, at auto overclock conditions, precision boost overdrive conditions. So you can see the conditions and you can change that in Windows. What I would then suggest, you go into the BIOS of the motherboard, you jump through the bunch of hoops that you have to get through, and the disclaimer, funny enough, that you have to go through to be able to mess around with precision boost overdrive, and then you manually disable this if you're not happy with your warranty being voided. So some of our X370 testing has been unsuccessful, to say the least. I mean, unsuccessful would be a complete understatement, if I'm being honest. It's been, well, disastrous, quite frankly. We tested a legacy X370 board with the Ryzen 3000 CPU, and it supposedly has Ryzen 3000 support according to the QVL and according to the AGESA 1002 version. But the stability is just, well, it's been laughably bad, quite frankly. There are RAM training issues. The mouse support is completely broken in the BIOS. I mean, like, it's quite useful to use mouse support when you're tweaking your fan curves. Otherwise, you're just going to have your fans at the default positions all the time, or the predefined positions, which are not ideal. So mouse support's broken. But more importantly, system stability is just terrible. You can't boot from a clean boot unless you clear the CMOS, launch into the BIOS, and then boot initially. If you power down, so not a hard power down, not turning the power switch off, if you shut down the system and then try and reboot, the board will get stuck at the memory training phase. So you're basically just stuck there, twiddling your thumbs, hoping it pushes through this. And the likelihood is it doesn't. So the consequence of this is that you cannot install Windows updates, because when you're doing the restart, the system will not restart. You have to power down, clear the CMOS, hope that it boots back up, go through the Windows update, which will detect that your system was powered down uncleanly, and then revert to the old Windows update second. Not ideal if you're on the 1903 version with the AMD clock cycle and benefits. And another consequence of this is that it's just kind of questionable stability during general usage of the system. I mean, you can make the argument of, well, just never shut down your system, leave it on or turn it on to sleep, and sleep does work fine. But that's not ideal, because I was using that tactic for about a day until I was watching YouTube, the system B-sodded and crashed, and then I just couldn't get it back up. Like I say, you can clear the CMOS and hope that this works, but it just doesn't seem to work a lot of the time, to the point where I've now actually taken the system out of usage and I've switched back to my old system on this without this X370 motherboard, and it's actually not a Ryzen system at the moment, unfortunately, because Ryzen would have suited my needs perfectly, but I cannot deal with the instability of this motherboard. So I sincerely hope this issue on the Crosshair 6 series of boards, and I tested with the Hero, I hope this gets fixed pretty quickly, especially as the Ryzen 3000 chips are on the QVL, and it's a frustrating issue. Speaking of backwards compatibility, I think backwards compatibility in general has been quite challenging. I think we should consider ourselves not fortunate, because this is what AMD promised, but I think we should be glad that AMD and the motherboard vendors are providing backwards compatibility for motherboards and for a platform that's 2.5 years old. I've seen some comments saying Intel would have forced you to upgrade motherboards and chipsets twice in this period of time, and that's probably true, to be honest. I mean, there are benefits to that approach. I mean, you can guarantee more than that stability is going to come from the motherboards and from the platform itself, so there are benefits there. but backwards compatibility for early adopters who can now upgrade to this 12-core and in the future 16-core chips. That's fantastic. Some of the issues we've seen with the likes of MSI are these light BIOSes, because the BIOS chips were too small to fit all the BIOS revisions on. So they've gone to a light BIOS, which strips down a bunch of the features in the UEFI. It's very bland looking, which is not a problem because the UEFI is just there for settings, but it strips out some of the key features like RAID support. And that's a bit annoying to lose. I mean, it's not a deal breaker. It will be for some people, but it's not a deal breaker in my opinion. But it's a bit annoying when, realistically, some of the motherboard vendors, in my opinion, should have had the foresight to put a bigger BIOS chip in there, when AMD has been saying for a long time we're going to support AMD AM4 for a long time. I think if a platform's going to be supported for a long time with a lot of SKUs consistently being released year upon year, it would have been wiser to put a BIOS chip that was sufficiently large on there from day one, especially because the cost of re-engineering your BIOS and the software in your BIOS to make it lighter and fit in that smaller chip probably massively outweighs the cost, or the bill of materials cost, of that slightly larger BIOS chip. So this is a bit of short-sightedness, but a lot of the vendors do deserve credit for going back through their stack and releasing BIOS profiles quite quickly following Ryzen 3000 launch, or before Ryzen 3000 launch, I must say, quite quickly for good support with the new chips, even if they're still going through these early teething issues. One backwards compatibility point that's really interesting is that we've seen some slides from ASUS that suggest PCIe Gen4 support is available with some of their older motherboards. Now it's a bit weird because the high-end motherboards on X470 and the likes that you would expect to have support, the Crosshair Lite and the likes, don't have full support, but some of the lower end motherboards do. That might be due to tracing, it might be due to the number of layers in the PCB, it might be due to interference because the more feature heavy boards have more components on there which are all fighting for the electronic space and fighting for interference with the Gen 4 links. But this is great for users who want to try that out, might want to stick a Gen 4 SSD in their older motherboard. I mean, Gen 4 for graphics cards at the moment is not really that important. It probably won't be for a while, to be honest, especially if you're not buying at the bleeding edge of graphics cards. But for PCIe SSDs, we've seen from our Aura sample 5 gigabytes a second. That's quite good. So we've spoken quite a lot about some of the BIOS issues, some of the backwards compatibility issues. Let's talk about software reading issues. And again, this was a point that Robert Hallock on his Reddit post did really, really well about explaining how these monitoring software packages work, how they can fight against each other, how they can display somewhat misleading information depending upon how you test them and how you're recording that data within the system. In general, we found Ryzen Master to be really good. Obviously, it's built by AMD, the software guys, so they, in theory, should be able to build the best piece of software that works with their chips. We found it to be good. It's pretty accurate in general, but there are situations where it has some weird bugs that could easily send you on a wild goose chase, and I hope our readers and our viewers across the pond know exactly what I mean with a wild goose chase. If not, Google's your friend. So with one of the BIOS versions that we tested, the Ryzen Master readings suggested that our CPU package power was not maxed out, nor was our TDC or EDC limits during a Cinebench R20 NT run, so a full multi-core run. But when we looked at the power readings from the wall, we were maxed out. When we looked at the performance figures, we were maxed out. So take some of these readings with a pinch of salt. We could have easily spent time trying to look into why this was the case if we didn't have our own performance data for comparison, but the performance was completely fine. So again, take this with a bit of a pinch of salt. One of the other issues we saw was that during stock testing with AIDA64, one of the BIOSes and one of the boards just decided that it wasn't going to be stable after about 30 minutes and crashed at stock conditions, which is far from ideal, shall we say. But upon rebooting after that crash, Ryzen Master showed that only one of the cores in our first CCD on our 3900X was actually active. So I was sweating and turning a bit more grey, a bit quicker when I thought that I'd just killed 5 cores from the 3900X. Luckily, this was just a software glitch in Ryzen Master that a simple reboot fixed, but it wasn't ideal for my heart rate or my stress levels. So I would say perhaps the most annoying Ryzen Master issue, in my opinion, that still persists, I remember mentioning this on day one of Ryzen 1000 launch, is the temperature sensor cycling. And this is a bit annoying because it feeds that data through to other software packages, and depending upon the motherboard which you use, whether it's a Nuvoton or an ITE sensor, it feeds that information through to the sensor, which then controls your system actual physical performance characteristics, such as the fan speed. So what we've seen, and I'm going to put a chart on screen, so we can see that when the system is operating under a relatively similar clock speed and a relatively similar package power level according to the software readings. The temperature readings are cycling up and down by a range of sometimes in the order of 10 degrees. So this is not really believable when the power is staying the same, the voltage isn't changing too much, the clock speed's staying roughly the same. So this does look like a sensor drift issue, and this is especially noticeable under stock load conditions and stock idle conditions. We've done a fair bit of testing with this, and it's quite easy to see this in operation in a physical characteristic, because if that data is being driven through to the sensor on your motherboard and then being driven through to the fan speed curves, especially when you're on an area which has high speed fans and therefore a big delta between minimum and maximum fan speed, you can hear the fans cycling up and then cycling down quite consistently, and they're following the temperature cycling on the sensor. So this is a bit annoying. It's not good really, because it could get you to a point where you see the maximum temperatures in your software read and think, uh-oh, the maximum temperatures are too high, I need to invest more money in a cooler, or I need to look for lower voltages for stability, but actually the average temperatures are realistically fine, it's just this sensor drift issue. It could also have problems by putting undue mechanical stress on your fans because they're constantly cycling up and down. It's just a bit annoying, to be honest. We hope AMD can look into this and try and understand what's happening. It could, for all I know, be a case of Precision Boost 2 working the way it should be by bouncing some of the settings up and down. I'm quite confident this is not the case because of what I just explained, with the clock frequency staying similar, the package power consumption is staying similar, the voltage is staying similar, but the range at which the temperature sensor is drifting is a bit too high when all those levels are staying relatively similar. So looking at boost clocks, because we know this has been one of the topics that the AGESA profiles were meant to address, and I know a lot of people have been talking about this. We did some of our own internal testing. We found that boost clocks were actually pretty decent, and this was run on an ASRock X570 Taichi with a AGESA 1.0.0.3 BIOS profile. So if we look at the graph, what we can see is that we're hovering around just below the 4100 megahertz region for all core load, which is what we reported with the 1.0.0.2 AGESA profile. And then we can see we're cycling up towards the 4600 megahertz level on the single-threaded workload. So the boosting situation seems to be okay. We did some testing for obviously our 1.0.0.2 numbers for launch and compared that to 1.0.0.3 and didn't realistically see any major performance differences outside of about 1 to 2% in certain scenarios. So yep, slight differences, but this is probably within what we would expect from a BIOS update, so not necessarily driven by the boost clocks themselves. We've also seen some comments regarding overclocking frequency and how this should improve with better BIOSes or better cooling or some stability updates. I'm not sure if this is the case, to be honest. It does seem to be a limit of the silicon. Now, AMD says Precision Boost 2 will just keep going until one of the main characteristics, whether that's temperatures or current or VRM limits, until one of those maximum levels is hit, and then you'll just stop. But that doesn't really make sense, because if you keep pushing all of those and take the limits away from all of those, it's not just going to go on until infinity. It doesn't work like that. It's going to hit a hard wall. Now, the hard wall for multi-core silicon, for the silicon in multi-core testing, seems to be around 4300 megahertz. You can't really go much higher unless you're using some exotic cooling or some heavy voltages, which bring their own challenges. I don't think this is too much of an issue in my opinion. People have been complaining about the overclocking frequency. So one of the ways of looking at this is that, okay, yeah, 200 or so megahertz extra for a real big efficiency penalty is probably not worth it. It's a bit boring, we could say, from the manual overclocking perspective. But I guess you can look at this on the other hand saying, well, actually you're paying for a certain level of performance and AMD is giving you most of that performance out of the box rather than leaving frequency or leaving performance on the table. So that's an alternative way of looking at it. I mean, obviously, the competitor Intel does have the advantage when it comes to all-out frequency with its mature 14++ process, but I think 4.3 gigahertz on a hefty chip, i.e. a dozen cores, for all-core frequency, and then the performance to back that up, I don't think that's too bad, personally. I think that's pretty good. It'd be interesting to see what AMD can do as the process matures, but I'm not sure if I'd be expecting much higher overclocking frequencies just through BIOS or AGESA updates. I don't think that's realistic. I think we are seeing the limits of some of the silicon or the power delivery or the thermal limitations with the CPUs. One other thing I want to get in there is that the chipset fans are just horrible. I've tested I've tested all the boards from all the vendors, and they're just so frustrating, honestly. I personally said before the launch that chipset fans are fine. I'm not too bothered. I've used them in the past. Some of the ASRock, I think it was the Z97 or the X99 OC Formula had a chipset fan, and it was completely fine. I didn't really notice it in your system. It was just fine. Didn't really worry about the noise output. Yeah, I know it has some kind of longevity and maintenance concerns and warranty concerns for that matter, but the noise wasn't really a big issue to me. These, however, they're just really annoying, to be perfectly honest. Some of the vendors don't have decent speed control whatsoever, so it's basically on or off, which is frustrating, especially when you can hear this over like a dual 120 AIO cooler, which we know they're not quiet, dual 120 AIO coolers with their high-speed fans, but you can hear the chipset fan whining over this, so bit frustrating. We're glad to see that some of the vendors and then the other vendors are also bringing in BIOS updates which allow better fan speed control. But the challenge here is we don't really know what the effect of higher chipset temperatures is at the moment, and it's something we'd be interested to test, or if you've got any data, please do share with us in the comments below on the KitGuru website. We don't really know what the effect of higher temperatures are. I mean, is it fine if our chipset run at a really high temperature? We're going to get better performance at a lower temperature? We don't really know at the moment. So yeah, you could go for your silent mode or for your 0 RPM fan mode on the chipset fan, but you might be losing performance. We don't know at the moment. So are you going to have to deal with that noise? You're going to have to deal with the mechanical fatigue on the fan, potentially aging or speeding up the aging process of your motherboard and the potential warranty return period of the motherboard. I know DeBauer has done some really good testing on power consumption from the X570 chipset, and I think his conclusion was actually, yeah, we don't really know why it needs a fan at the moment. So I would like to see more passive solutions. Obviously, Gigabyte with the Aorus Extreme have got a really smart solution for allowing the chipset to operate without a fan by branching the heat pipe up to the very well overbuilt VRM heatsink. This is good to see. More vendors need to follow suit here and just invest some time, invest some money, invest some staff hours and some engineering hours into designing a smart chipset heatsink. Adding a fan is not really the best solution under all scenarios. I mean, it's just introducing a new point of failure. Yeah, it's the cheapest solution for your engineering guys, but it's not the best solution for your brand, in my opinion. So I think that will do it for this one. I mean, this probably comes off as a massive rant after a really tiring few weeks in the industry with just launches galore, which has been really fun. And it's good to see the really good situation that the industry's in at the moment, fighting hard on the CPU front between AMD and Intel, and obviously on the GPU side of things, AMD and Nvidia are both fighting hard. And this is just great for us consumers, great for us enthusiasts. I think we're in a really exciting time in the industry at the moment. So it's not intended to be a rant, probably comes across that way, but it's more intended to be a discussion that we can all have about some of the issues at the moment, some of the strengths and weaknesses, how we can get around these, what the motherboard manufacturers need to work on, what we need to keep an eye out for as users, what we can do regarding BIOS updates, regarding manual tuning, all these other things. We can have a discussion, we can look at the issues, and then we can come together and try and find a solution or try and find a way to operate safely and smartly until these stable BIOSes do come out. So as a brief side note, closing off, I often have the conversation with Leo on what was the most difficult platform introduction or the most difficult launch. Now, obviously, Ryzen Mark 1 had kind of some issues. RAM speed support was really challenging. BIOSes and motherboards were challenging at that point of time. We had kind of weird situations with the dividers where like a 3 GHz divider on the memory wouldn't work. You only wanted B die to work at certain speeds. You couldn't put 4 DIMMs in. You couldn't do this and that. You had to RAM train. It was tough, but I'm still confident that this launch has been nowhere near as challenging, nowhere near as problematic from a stability concern. And personally, I still think X99 Haswell E with the introduction of DDR4 was the most challenging launch, but that's up for debate, certainly. So I'm sure myself and Leo will continue to have these conversations while all the creases are being ironed out of the new Ryzen 3000, AM4 and Zen 2 and X570 and all the other acronyms until the new creases are ironed out of this platform. So thanks for watching. It's been Luke Hill for KitGuru. If you enjoyed this, make sure you like, subscribe, check out our Patreon page. Please do go over to the KitGuru page to leave your comments. Leave comments in the YouTube section down below. You know what you can do to support us. And until next time, I'm going to go and sleep because I think it's long overdue. See you in the next one.